Earlier in the course, you learned about ng4, which is one of the built-in directives in Angular that we use for rendering lists. In this section, we're going to look at ng4 in more detail. We're also going to look at the other built-in directives, including ngIf, ngSwitchCase, ngClass, and ngStyle. And finally, we'll wrap up this section by looking at building custom directives in Angular. So let's get started. There are times that you may want to show or hide part of a page depending on some condition. So here in app component, I'm going to define a field, courses, set it to an array with 2 items. Now for now, we're just going to use simple numbers. In a real world application, you're going to have the actual course objects. But let's not worry about that and just focus on showing or hiding part of a page. Now, in our app.component.html file, if we have any courses in this array, we want to render them in a list. Otherwise, we want to display a message to the user like there are no courses yet. So first, I'm going to create a div. This is where we're going to display the list of courses. Now here, again, I'm simplifying this example. If you want to render the list of courses, you would use a UL and LI with the ng4 directive. So here's one div for displaying the list of courses. And here's another for displaying a message like no courses yet. We want to render one div or the other depending on the number of items in our courses array. For that, we use the ngIf directive. So to refresh your memory, we use directives to modify the DOM. Now there are 2 types of directives. Structural directives modify the structure of the DOM by adding or removing DOM elements. Attribute directives modify the attributes of DOM elements. So here we want to change or modify the structure of our DOM. We want to add or remove one DOM element. So whenever you're using structural directives, you need to prefix them with an asterisk. And I'm going to explain the reason later in this section. So asterisk ngIf. Now here we add the condition. If this condition evaluates to truthy, this div will be rendered in the DOM. So we can add something like courses that length greater than 0. Now you don't necessarily have to write the condition here. You may have a method in your class like this. Do we have any courses? When we call this method, we get some value. If that value evaluates to truthy, then this div will be rendered. Now let's revert this back. Now we can use the same technique with the other div. And this is the old approach before Angular 4. So let's see how that works. ngIf, I want to render this div if we don't have any courses. So courses that length equals 0. Now back in the browser. So because we have 2 items in our array, we see the list of courses message. Now back in our component, I'm going to empty this array, save, back in the browser. Now we get no courses yet message. Let's inspect this. So here under app root, look, we have only one div, which is the div with the message no courses yet. So the other div is not in the DOM. And that's what I want you to pay attention to. So when you use ngIf, if this condition evaluates to truthy, this element will be added to the DOM. Otherwise, it will be removed from the DOM. Now in Angular 4, now we have a slightly different syntax to implement the exact same feature. So instead of repeating ngIf twice with this condition reversed, we can implement it using an if and else kind of approach, just like how we have if and else in a lot of programming languages. So first we need to change the type of this second element from div to ngTemplate. So ng-template. Then we remove this ngIf, make the code cleaner, but we need to assign this template an identifier. Earlier, you learned that you can use this hashtag to define a template variable. Let's call this block no courses. Then we modify our ngIf. So after the condition, we add a semicolon and we type else and then the name of our template variable, no courses. Note that I didn't add this hashtag here, just the name of our template variable. So if this condition is truthy, this block will be rendered. otherwise the other block. Let's try it. Back in the browser. So currently we don't have any courses, and that's why we see this message. If I go back in app component and add a couple of items here, now we see the list of courses. Now you may not quite like this syntax because in the first block we're using a div, in the second block we're using ng template. They're kind of inconsistent. There is another approach. So we can define another ng template here, ng template, and this is for displaying the list of courses. So we assign it an identifier like courses list, and here we add that message, list of courses. Okay, now we have one div with two templates, one for the condition that is truthy and the other for condition that is falsy. Okay, now we need to change our ng if. So first we add our condition. If this condition is truthy, we add then, and here we specify the name of our ng template. So courses list. And then we have else, and here's the other block. So note that we have a semicolon after the condition. Then we have then as a keyword. Here is the name of our target block or target template. After that, we have else as a keyword, and finally the name of the other template. I personally prefer this approach because it's more clear and more consistent. Now there is another approach to show or hide part of a page, and that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture. Now back in the same example, let me show you another way to show or hide part of a page. Instead of using the ngIf directive, we can use the hidden attribute. So in HTML, we can apply this hidden attribute to our divs to hide them. Now if you go back in the browser, we should see no courses yet message. Here's the message, beautiful. Now this attribute in HTML also exists as a property in our DOM objects. So we can use property binding and bind this property of the underlying DOM object to some expression. For example, here I want to hide this first div if we don't have any courses. So courses.length equals 0. Now similarly, we can hide the second div if we have at least one course. So courses.length greater than 0. Now back in the app component, currently we have two items here. Let's see if application is working properly. So we get the list of courses, beautiful. Now back in app component, I'm going to empty this array, save, and back in the browser, no courses yet. Beautiful. Now let me show you something. Let's inspect this element. Note that both divs exist in our DOM, but the first div has the hidden attribute, and that's why it's hidden. So that's the main difference between using ngIf and the hidden property. When we use ngIf on an element, if the condition evaluates to falsy, that element is removed from the DOM. Whereas when we use the hidden attribute, the element is in the DOM, it's just hidden. So you might ask, which approach is better? Well, if you're working with a large tree with a lot of children, it's better to use ngIf because these elements can take substantial memory and computing resources. You don't want to put them in the DOM if you're not going to show them to the user. Plus, Angular may continue to check for changes even to invisible properties. So the change detection mechanism in Angular, that's the mechanism that keeps your views in sync with your components, that's running in the background. And when these elements are in the DOM, Angular continues to perform change tracking on these elements. So in these situations, if you're dealing with a large tree with a lot of DOM objects, it's better to use ngIf to free up resources. There is just one exception. In some situations, building a large element tree in the right state may be costly. So if you have a page with an element subtree, in that case, ngIf may have a negative impact on the performance of that page. So if the user is going to click a button to toggle something to show or hide that part of the page, if building that element tree is costly, you shouldn't use ngIf. It's better to keep it in the DOM and hide it using the hidden attribute. So in summary, if you're dealing with a small tree of objects, it doesn't matter which approach you choose, it's purely your personal preference. If you're working with a large tree, first check to see if building that tree is going to be costly or not. If it's costly, use the hidden property to keep it in the DOM but hide it. Otherwise, it's better to use ngIf to remove it from the DOM and free up the resources. In Angular, we have another directive called ngSwitchCase, which is very similar to the concept of switch case we have in a lot of programming languages. So imagine we want to build a page to display properties on a map or in a list. So here we have two tabs, map view and list view. When we select the list view, we see the list view content. And when we select the map view, we see map view content. So let me show you how to implement this with ngSwitchCase. And by the way, you can implement the exact same thing with ngIf, but ngIf works only if you have a truthy and a falsy condition. In this case, we might have multiple tabs, so we cannot implement that using ngIf, and that's why we need ngSwitchCase. So in app component.html, I want to add some basic markup to render bootstrap tabs. So here we want a UL, and this UL should have two classes. So we add .nav and also .nav-pills. This syntax you see here is what we call Zen coding. And with this, we can quickly generate HTML markup. So tab, now we have a UL with these two classes. Now inside this UL, we want an LI, and inside this LI, we want an anchor. Now we want two of these elements. So I put them in parentheses times 2. Tab, and this is what we get. Now let me temporarily make the first LI active. So I apply the active class here and name this map view. The second LI, the anchor, should be called list view. Now below that, we'll have a div. And here we'll have either the content of the map view, so map view content, or list view content. Now I want to temporarily comment this out because one content div will be rendered dynamically. Now, let's just make sure that our markup is working. Back in the browser. All right, it looks good, beautiful. Now let's move on and make this dynamic. So let's go to our app component. Here we need to define a field to keep track of the currently selected tab. We can call this view mode, and we can set this initially to map. And then we can change this to list. So it can hold one of these two values, map or list. Now back in our template, let's bring this div back. We want to render one of these divs dynamically based on the value of view mode field. So on this top parent div, we're going to apply property binding. So Angular adds a new property to our DOM elements that is not part of the standard DOM. This property is called ngSwitch. We can use property binding, ngSwitch, and bind this to a field in our class, like view mode. Now, on each div, we'll apply ngSwitchCase directive. And because with this directive, we add or remove a DOM element, this is a structural directive, and we should prefix it with an asterisk. So ngSwitchCase. Now, if the value of view mode is map, so map as a string, note that I put map in single quotes. Let me zoom in. So we have double quotes, which is for the value of this directive, and we have single quotes, which is for the map as a string. Okay. Now, similarly, for the other div, I'm going to apply ngSwitchCase. We want to render this div if the value of view mode is list. Now, optionally, we can have another div. So if the value of view mode is something else, I want to render this div. So here we add ngSwitch default, and it doesn't have a value. We apply it like an attribute, okay? So let's add some label here, otherwise, right? So this is how we use the ngSwitch directive. Now, finally, we want to make this class active dynamic. So we can use class binding. We put it in square brackets, class.active, and we want to render this if view mode is set to map. So we can write a simple conditional statement here, view mode equals map. Okay? And similarly for the other li, I'm going to add another class binding, class.active. We set this if view mode equals list. Now finally, when we click these links here, we want to change the view mode. So let's remove this href attribute. We use event binding and bind the click event to an expression. Now here we can simply call a method in our class like change view mode and simply pass a string like map, but that method is going to be a one-liner. So we can simply write that expression here. So we simply set view mode to map. Okay, and I'm going to copy this and apply it to the other link as well. But this time I'm going to change this value to list. All right, now let's test the application. So back in the browser, initially the map view is visible because we set the view mode to map in our component. If we click list, we go to the list view and back to the map view. Now back in the component, I'm going to change this value to something else. With this other div that we applied ng-switch default directive to, this one should be rendered. So look, we get the otherwise message here. So here's the lesson. If you want to compare the value of a field or a property against multiple values, use the ng-switch case directive. All right, you have seen the ng-for directive before. We use this directive to render a list of objects. So let's review this one more time, and this time I'm going to show you more details about this directive. So here in app component, I'm going to define a new field called courses and set this to an array of objects. In this array, we're going to have 3 course objects. And for each course, we're going to have 2 properties. One is ID and the other is the name. So course 1. Now I'm going to duplicate this. So ID 2 and 3, and obviously course 2 and course 3. Now let's use the ng-for directive to render these on the view. So app.component.html, we want to have a UL, and inside this UL, we need an li. Tab, that's the markup. Now we add ng-for, and here as the value, we type let course of courses. And then we can use interpolation to render the name of each course. So course.name. Let's make sure the application works up to this point. So back in the browser, okay, we got 3 courses on the screen. Beautiful. Now this ng-for directive exports a bunch of values that might help you build certain features. For example, imagine you want to render a table and you want to highlight the first row, or maybe you want to highlight the last row, or you want to highlight the odd or even rows, or maybe you want to display an index next to each object. We can use the exported values from ng-for directive. So here after this expression, we add semicolon. One of these exported values is index. So we type index. Now we need to alias this to a local variable. So we type as, and then the name of our local variable, like I. So with this expression, we get the value of the index and put it in a local variable called I. And then we can use interpolation to render I on the screen. So like this, I. All right, now let's test this. Back in the browser, look, before each course, we have its index in our courses field. So as you can see, the index of the first item or the first course is 0. Now, index is one of these exported values. There are several other. Let me show you how you can find the list of all these exported values. So if you head over to angular.io, in the search box, you can search for ng-for of directive. That's the name of our directive. Even though in HTML we use ng-for, but the actual name of this directive is ng-for of. And you can see that here, it has a D icon, which indicates a directive. Now on this page, if you scroll down, under local variables, you can see all these exported values. So you saw index, we also have first, last, even, and odd. So let me show you one more example. Let's say we want to render a table and we want to highlight all the even rows. So we can get access to the even value and alias this as a local variable, is even. Because this even is a Boolean, unlike the index, which is a number, even, odd, first, and last values, they are all Boolean. Now here, next to each course, I want to render a span. And I want to render this only if this is an even row. So ng if is even. For now, I just add a simple label. Now in your applications, you might want to render a table. So you can use this variable is even and apply some style or some class to even rows in your table. Now let's try this. Back in the browser. So you can see in front of the first and the third rows, we have this label, even. All right, now let me show you how this ng4 directive responds to the changes in the component state. So on the top, I want to add a button. With this button, we want to add a new course in our list. So here we can handle the click event and bind this to a method called onAdd. Okay, now back in the component, let's add this new method here. So onAdd. We call this .courses.push, and we push a new object here, ID 4, and name is going to be course 4. Save, back in the browser. So here we have 3 courses. When I click the add button, we get a new course here. So Angular has this change detection mechanism. So whenever you click a button, or whenever an AJAX request or a timer function completes, Angular performs its change detection. It looks at our component. It knows that this courses field now has a new object. That's the course with ID 4. So then it will render that course using this template. Now, similarly, we can add a button next to each course to remove it. So button, remove. And here we can handle the click event and bind this to this expression. We're going to call onRemove method in our class. And as an argument, we can pass this course object that we have in each iteration. That is the course object here. Okay. Now back in the component. So similarly, I'm going to add another method onRemove. Here we get a course object. Now to remove this from an array, first we need to find the index of this course in the array. So this courses dot index of this course object. We get the index, and then we call this dot courses dot splice. So we go to that index and delete one object. Let's try it. So back in the browser. Now if I click this remove button, course number 2 will be removed. There you go. So once again, after the execution of this onRemove method, Angular performed its change detection. It realized that one of the objects in our courses array is no longer there. So it removed the corresponding list item in the DOM. Now similarly, if we modify an existing object, again, Angular will refresh the DOM automatically. So let's change the name of this method from onRemove to onChange. Back in the component, rename it here. Now, instead of removing this course from the array, I'm simply going to change its name. Update it, like that. Let's test the application. We forgot to change the label, it doesn't matter. So when we click this, the name of the course changes. Again, this is change detection in action. In the next lecture, we're going to look at this change detection from a performance point of view. So once again, in app component, we have this field courses with 3 objects. Now let's simulate something. Let's simulate a scenario where we get these courses from the server. So in our template, I want to add a button on top. Let's call this load courses. And when we click this button, we're going to execute load courses method. Okay, now back in the component, I'm going to add this method, load courses. And then I'm going to set this courses field in that method. So delete, and we set this dot courses to this array. So when we call this function, we're going to initialize this courses field. Now in this particular demo, we're going to explicitly load the courses, but in a lot of real-world applications, this happens automatically when you land on a page. Now, don't worry about that aspect. What we are focusing on here is that every time we click this button, we are resetting this courses field to a new array. Okay, so save, back in the browser. Now I'm going to open up Chrome Developer Tools and put it on the left side of the screen. So inspect, it's here. Let's expand the body element. Here's the app root. This is our button. Now I'm going to click this. All right, look, we have a UL, and this is where we have our courses. So a UL with 3 LIs, right? Now look what happens every time I click this button. You will see a quick purple highlight on the left side of the screen. Look, do you know what that means? That means every time we click this button, Angular is reconstructing this UL element. Look, now this is so fast, it doesn't have any performance overhead, but if you're working with a large list or a list with a complex markup, and sometime during the life cycle of your page, you're going to call the backend to download these objects, Angular is going to reconstruct this entire DOM object tree. And this can be costly if you're dealing with a large complex list. Now let's see how we can optimize this. Angular by default tracks objects by their identity. So here we have 3 objects. These objects have 3 different references in the memory. When we reset this courses field, even though we're dealing with the exact same content, as in course with ID 1, course with ID 2 and 3, but these objects will be different from the previous ones in the memory. So Angular sees this as new content, and that's why it reconstructs that DOM tree. Now, back in our template, here in the ng4 directive, we have this ability to change how Angular tracks objects. So as I said, by default, it tracks them based on the object identity, which means the reference of that object in the memory. So if we re-download course with ID 1, every time we re-download that course is going to be a different object in the memory, even though the content of those objects are going to be equal. Now, we want to instruct Angular to use a different mechanism to track objects. So instead of tracking them by their identity or the reference in the memory, we want to track them by their ID. So course with ID 1 is always course with ID 1. So if you re-download the exact same course from the server and none of the properties are changed, Angular will not re-render that DOM element. So here we add track by, and we set this to a method in our class. Let's say track course. Note that here I'm not calling this method. I'm simply adding the name of the method as a reference. Okay. Now let's go ahead and implement this method. So back in our app component, I'm going to add track course. This method should take 2 parameters, index and course. Now here we want to check if we have a course object, we want to return its ID. Otherwise, we return undefined. Now with this method, we change how Angular tracks course objects. So instead of tracking them by the object identity, it tracks them by their IDs. Let's try this. Back in the browser. So I'm going to click load courses. Now here, look, this is where we have the list of courses. So a UL and a bunch of LIs. Now I'm going to click load courses several times, and you will no longer see that purple highlight on the left side of the screen. See? Nothing is happening. So Angular is not re-rendering this UL and its children, because every time we reset our courses field, we're using the same course objects. These course objects have the same ID. So here's the lesson. If you're dealing with a simple list, don't worry about the track by feature. You don't need this. Angular performs well out of the box. However, If you're dealing with a large list with complex markup, and you do observe performance problems on a given page, you can try using track by to improve the performance of that page. So don't use it by default in every page because you have to write more code and you won't gain any performance benefits. So use it only when you need to. So what is this leading asterisk? Well, earlier you saw this ngIf with the else syntax. So here, if we have any courses, we display them on the screen. Otherwise, we use this ng template to render the no courses message. Now, when we use this leading asterisk on ngIf, we are telling Angular to rewrite this markup, rewrite this block using an ng template element. So when Angular sees this leading asterisk, it's going to rewrite our div like this. It's going to create an ng template. It's going to put our div inside this template and the content of this div, which is list of courses. And then it's going to apply ngIf as property binding on this ng template. So property binding, ngIf is going to bind this to an expression, courses.length greater than 0. And then for the else part, it's going to apply similar property binding on the other ng template. So ngIf is going to take the same expression, which is courses.length greater than 0, and then apply the not operator to reverse this condition. So here's the lesson. When we use the leading asterisk with our structural directives, like ngIf, ng-for, and ng-switch case, Angular is going to rewrite that block using an ng template. Now, obviously, we can do this ourselves, but it's much easier to use the leading asterisk and let Angular do the hard work. So this is all about the leading asterisk. So earlier we built this favorite component, and here we used class binding twice to dynamically render glyphicon-star or glyphicon-star-empty classes. While this approach works perfectly fine, there is also another way to deal with multiple classes, and you might find this other approach a little bit cleaner. So instead of using class binding twice here, we can use the ng-class directive. So we bind ng-class to an expression. And here we're going to have an object. And this object, we're going to have one or more key value pairs. Each key represents a CSS class. And the value for that key determines if that class should be rendered or not. So here we're dealing with two classes, so we need two keys. One is glyphicon-star. And the value for this key is selected. So if this evalu is true, then this class will be rendered in the DOM. Note that I've put the key in quotes, and this is a requirement. Otherwise, this is not going to work. Now let's add the other key. So once again, quotes, glyphicon-star-empty, and we set this to not is selected. So with the ng-class directive, we don't have to repeat class binding twice, and we can simply delete these two lines. Now let's look at the result. So here's our icon, click, click, beautiful. So this ng-class is an example of an attribute directive. We use it to modify attributes of an existing DOM element. All right, now in app component, I have defined this field, can save, and set this to true. Now let's go to the template for this file. Here we have a button element with three style bindings. We have style.backgroundColor, style.color, and style.fontWeight. And for each style binding, you can see we have an expression that uses the value of can save to determine the value for that style. So if can save is true, background color is going to be blue, otherwise it's going to be gray. And similarly, we have these two other styles here, color and font weight. Now, if you look in the browser, so if can save is true, this is what we're going to get. Otherwise, if we go to app component and change this to false, this is what we're going to get. Now this template, as you can see, is a little bit noisy. In the last lecture, you learned how we can use the ngClass directive to clean up multiple class bindings. Now, similarly, we have another directive, another attribute directive called ngStyle. So when you're dealing with multiple style bindings, you may prefer to clean up your code by using the ngStyle directive. So let's see what we can do here. Once again, we use property binding syntax and bind ngStyle to an expression. And here we're going to have an object. In this object, we're going to have one or more key value pairs. Each key represents a CSS style. So we put it in quotes just like before, background color. And then for the value, we use the same value we had in the style binding. So if can save is true, we're going to use blue. Otherwise, we're going to use gray. Now, similarly, we can have another key value pair here. So color is going to be white or black. Now, obviously, this is not the best way to implement this feature. If you're dealing with multiple styles, it's better to encapsulate them in a CSS class. And then depending on the value of can save, you render one of these classes instead of adding multiple styles here. But sometimes in certain situations, you may want to add styles explicitly here. So if that's the case, use either style binding or the ngStyle directive to add multiple styles altogether. All right, now in app component, I have defined a field called task. Here we have an object with two properties, title and assignee, which is another object itself. This assignee has a name property, which is set to John Smith. Now in the template for this component, you can see I've used a span with interpolation to render the name of the assignee for this task. So when we go to the browser, we see John Smith on the screen. Now, sometimes when you're dealing with complex objects, it is possible that the value of a property may be null or undefined for a certain period of time. For example, you might want to call different endpoints to get these objects from the server. So then assignee might be null for maybe a fraction of a second. Let me simulate this scenario. So I'm going to change the value of this property to null. Now back in the browser, we have a blank screen. So let's take a look at the console. Look at this error. Cannot read property name of null. So because assignee is null, we cannot access the name property here. Now there are two solutions to solve this problem. One way is to use the ngIf directive. So ngIf, we want to render this span only if this task object has an assignee. So task.assignee. If this evaluates to truthy, then this span will be rendered. So save, back in the browser. So look, we have no errors in the console and there is nothing on the screen. Now there is also another way to solve this problem. So maybe you want to keep the span in the DOM, but you don't want to render the name of the assignee if it's null. So let's remove this ngIf. We can use what we call safe traversal operator. So because assignee can be null or undefined, we put a question mark after it before the dot. Now with this syntax, if assignee is null or undefined, Angular is going to ignore this. Otherwise, it's going to render the name property of the assignee on the screen. So let's go back to the browser. Look, we have no errors. And if we inspect the DOM, so under app root, we have our span, but there is nothing inside this span. So this is safe traversal operator. Be aware of it. You may want to use this when dealing with complex objects. There are times that you want to have control over the behavior of DOM elements. For example, look at this input field here. If I type my name like this and press tab, note that my name becomes lowercase. Now, this is a simplified example. In a real-world application, you may want to add this behavior. So let's say we have an input field for the user to enter their phone number. So they add 12345678990. Now, the standard way to format an American phone number is like this. So the first three digits in parentheses, then 3 more digits, and then a hyphen. So as the user types their phone number into this input field and moves away, you may want to reformat this value using a standard American phone number format. In situations like that, we use directives. So let me show you how to implement a simple directive in Angular. Now, similar to components and services, we can create a directive from scratch, or we can use Angular CLI to generate a directive with some boilerplate code. So open up the terminal and type ng g d for directive, and let's call this directive input-format. So this creates 2 files. One is a unit test file and the other is the actual directive file. And it also modifies app.module. So let's quickly go to app module. In our ng module, inside declarations, you can see now we have input format directive. So as I told you before, in this declarations array, we should register all the components, all the pipes, and all the directives that are part of this module. If you don't do this, you're going to get a runtime error. Now let's go to our input format directive. So this is very similar to a component. You can see we have a TypeScript class called input format directive, and this class is decorated with the directive decorator function. Here we have a selector exactly like components, but the selector has square brackets, which basically means any elements that has this attribute, app input format. If Angular finds an element with this attribute, it's going to apply this directive on that element. Now, as a best practice, it's good to prefix your directives so they don't clash with the standard HTML attributes or other directives defined in third-party libraries. So here we have app as a prefix to app input format directive. Now let's move on to the actual implementation of this directive. So here we want to handle 2 DOM events, focus and blur. First, on the top, we need to import a decorator function, host listener from Angular/core. This decorator allows us to subscribe to the events raised from the DOM element, that is the DOM element that is hosting this directive, or in other words, that's the DOM element that has this attribute. So let's see how we can use host listener. First, I'm going to define a method here on focus. So whenever we get the focus in our input field, we want this method to be called. For now, I just want to log something in the console on focus. Now we need to decorate this method with the host listener decorator. So @ host listener. And as the argument, we need to supply the name of the DOM event, that is focus. Now I'm going to select this code, duplicate it, and change the second instance to blur, unblur, and unblur. Let's test the application up to this point. So let's go to app.component.html. Here I'm going to add an input and apply app input format attribute on this element. With this attribute, Angular is going to apply our custom directive to this input field. So let's test this. Back in the browser. So here's our input field. I'm going to click here and then outside. Now let's take a look at the console. So we have these 2 messages, on focus and on blur. Now let's implement the logic to change the value of this input field to a lowercase string. In this particular demo, we don't really need this on focus. I just wanted to show you how it works because we do the formatting once the user clicks outside this input field. So let's delete this. In on blur, I need to get the value for this input field. First, we need a reference to the host element. So in our constructor, we need to inject an element reference object. So private L of type element ref. This is a service defined in Angular that gives us access to a DOM object. So let's import this on the top. You can see this is defined in Angular/core. Okay. Now, as a best practice, we should always put our constructors before all our methods. So this tells me immediately what are the dependencies of this class. Now in onBlur, first we need to read the value of this input field. So let value equal this.l, and here we access the native element property. This gives us access to the actual DOM object. So from here we can read the value property, and then we can simply set this.l.native element.value to value dot. Now here the type of value is any, as you can see here. So I'm going to use type annotation to tell TypeScript compiler that this is actually a string. And with this, we can access all the methods defined in the string class. So here I'm going to use 2 lowercase. Let's test the application. So back in the browser, I'm going to type my name here, press tab, beautiful. Now it's lowercase. Now back in app component.html, it would be nice to have the flexibility to tell the directive about the target format. Maybe here we want to reformat this string as lowercase, but somewhere else we want to reformat it as uppercase. So if we had a property like format, then we could use property binding like this. We can set this to uppercase string. Note that here I've put my uppercase word in single quotes to specify that this is a string, not a property of the app component, okay? So how do we implement this? You should already know. We're going to define a field called format and mark it as an input property. As simple as that. So back in our directive, let's define this new field, format, and decorate it with the input decorator. Now, as a best practice, I told you always use a string alias here to keep the contract of your directives or your components stable. Now finally, we need to import this type from Angular/core. And then in onBlur method, we can check if this.format equals lowercase, we will reformat this string as lowercase. Otherwise, we're going to reformat it as uppercase. Okay, that's better. So let's go back to our app component.html. Here I have used uppercase. So let's test the application. I'm going to type my name one more time, tab. Now it's uppercase. Beautiful. The only issue here is that we have to apply this directive as an attribute and then use property binding to set the target format. Since we have only one input property here, it would be nicer to set the target format while applying the directive as an attribute, like this. We could use square brackets here and then set this to uppercase. Then we wouldn't have to bind to the format property. This is cleaner, right? So how can we implement this? Very easy. Let's go back to our directive. So all we have to do here is to change this format to the selector of our directive. So app input format. Let's try it. Back in the browser, I'm going to type my name, tab, beautiful. So here's the lesson. You can use custom directives to have more control over behavior of DOM elements. You can pass data to your directives using input properties. And if you have only one property, you can use the selector of that directive as an alias for that property, and this simplifies the usage of your custom directive. And finally, you can use the host listener decorator to subscribe to the events raised from the host DOM object. All right, now it's time for another exercise. I want you to implement a zippy component like this. So here we have two horizontal tabs, shipping details and billing details. When we click on any of these tabs, it expands, and here we can see the content. Here we can have a form or some complex markup. When we click again, the zippy component collapses, and same for the other zippy component. So this is the API for this zippy component. The component element is zippy. It has a title property, which is an input property. Note that here I have not bound this title property to a property in our app component. I've simply set this to a string. So there is no property binding syntax here. And this is a one-time initialization. Now, between the zippy elements, this is where we put the content of the zippy. So here we can have some complex markup or just simple text. So go ahead and use what you have learned in this section to implement the zippy component. All right, I'm going to start by creating a new component. So ngGC zippy. Beautiful. Now, just like always, I want to implement this in a step-by-step fashion. In each step, I'm going to focus only on one thing instead of doing too many things. So first, let's define the components API. So in app component, I want to be able to use this zippy component like this. Zippy, set the title, let's say shipping details, and I want to add the actual content here, shipping details content. Now, in order to implement this, we need to go to our zippy component.ts. First, we need to change the selector to zippy. Then I'm going to remove all this code that we don't need. Okay. Now, in order to pass the title, we need an input property. So input title, title of type string. Now let's go to zippy.html. Delete this. I'm going to add a parent div, which is the container for our zippy. I'm going to give it a class called zippy. Now inside this div, we're going to have two divs, one for the heading and the other for the body. So div with the class heading, and next to that, we're going to have another div with the class body. Now here in the heading, I want to render the title. So interpolation, title. And in the body, I want to add ng-content so we can inject markup from the outside. Let's test the application up to this point. So back in the browser, okay, the application seems to be working. Let's quickly inspect these elements. So here's our parent or the container div with the class zippy. Inside this div, we have two divs. One is heading, and this is our title. And next to that, we have body. Now, it would be better to prefix these classes with zippy. This will make our code more maintainable. So back in the template, I'm going to prefix this with zippy dash, and same here, zippy dash body. Now we have some kind of hierarchy. Next, I want to apply some styles to this component. So let's go to zippy.css. Now, this is where your implementation might be different from mine, and it doesn't really matter because the styles I'm going to apply here are purely my personal choice. You may apply different styles, and that's perfectly fine. So for our parent div, I want to add a border. Let's say 1 pixel, solid, CCC, which is gray. And I want to apply a border radius of 2 pixels to make it a little bit round. Now for our heading, I want to make the font bold. So font weight, bold. And I want to apply 20 pixel padding so the text is not too close to the edges of the div. Also, I want to set the cursor to pointer here so it looks clickable. Now for the other div, zippy-body, once again, I want to apply 20 pixel padding. Let's have a quick look. So it looks a little bit better, but when the zippy is expanded, I want to make the heading gray so it separates from the actual body area. So I'm going to define a new class here, expanded, with background color set to F0, F0, F0. And I want to apply this dynamically only when the zippy is open. So back in the template, here's the heading. I want to use class binding. So class dot expanded. I want to set this if the zippy is expanded. So I'm going to bind this to is expanded field. Now let's go to zippy.ts. I'm going to define this field here, is expanded of type Boolean. And I want to initially set this to true to test our new CSS class. So save, back in the browser. Okay, this is much better. So now we need to implement the expanding and collapsing behavior. Back in the template, here in the heading, I want to bind the click event to a method called onClick. So let's go and implement this method. Back in the component, onClick, and here we simply toggle the isExpanded field. So this that is expanded, we set this to not this that is expanded. Now one more time, back in the template, we want to render this body only if the zippy is expanded. So here we apply ngIf and bind this to isExpanded field. You can use the hidden property here, and that's perfectly fine. So save, back in the browser. So initially the zippy is open or expanded. When we click here, it collapses. When we click again, it expands. Beautiful. Now, I don't quite like the name of this method here, because when someone looks at this markup, they have to go and look at the implementation of the onClick method to figure out what is happening there. A better name for this method would be toggle. Now our markup is more readable. So basically when we click the heading, this will toggle the zippy. I don't have to look at the implementation of this method to figure out what is the behavior of this component. Okay, so let's go back to our component and rename this method here, toggle. Also, I'm going to remove this initialization because this was purely for testing. Now, one last step. We need to add a glyph icon. So here in the heading, after the title, I want to render a glyph icon. So here, we need a span with the class glyph icon. And depending on the state of the zippy, we want to render either a chevron up or chevron down. So tab. Now here we can use class binding, or we can use the ng-class directive. So we bind this to an object. In this object, we're going to have two keys. One is glyph icon dash chevron dash up. And we want to render this class if the zippy is expanded. Now, similarly, we're going to have another key here, glyph icon dash chevron dash down. And we want to render this if the zippy is not expanded. So not is expanded. All right, back in the browser. So here's our icon, click, now it's up, click, now it's down. Beautiful. I just want to put this on the right side of our heading. So let's go to zippy.css. And here we're going to add another class, glyph icon. I'm going to use float right to put this on the right side of the heading. Save, back in the browser, and here's our icon.